Scientists found a Neanderthal who shouldn't exist. In 2024, when they sequenced his genome, his DNA told a story that contradicted everything. He lived 42,000 years ago, yet his genetic code was 50,000 years old. He was surrounded by other Neanderthals, yet his DNA showed zero contact with them. Ever. Not once in 50 millennia. He walked the same valleys, breathed the same air, lived within miles of other groups of his own species, and his entire bloodline never exchanged a single gene with theirs. And here's what terrifies scientists. His isolation didn't happen because he was geographically cut off. It happened by choice, by deliberate separation, by social fractures so profound that even as his species was dying out, his group refused to mix. This is the story of Thoren, the Neanderthal who reveals a darker truth, that Neanderthals didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were divided, fractured, broken into pieces that couldn't or wouldn't come back together. For 17 years, a paleoanthropologist named Ludovic Slimak excavated a cave in southern France. Grotte Mandrin sits perched above the Rhone Valley, a narrow rock shelter that has been a human dwelling for hundreds of thousands of years. From 1998 onwards, Slimak and his team dug into the sediment, layer by layer, moving through millennia of occupation. They removed stone carefully. They cataloged ash. They documented every artifact, every tool, every fragment that might contain information about who lived here and when. Year after year, they found almost nothing. Empty stone, ash from ancient fires, fragments of tools from various periods, but no bones, no teeth, no evidence of the creatures they were searching for. The work was grueling. The progress was glacial. Most archaeologists would have given up. Most projects would have been abandoned, but Slimak believed in this place. He believed there was something here waiting to be discovered. And then, in 2015, something changed. A single fragment of a jawbone emerged from the earth. It was small. It was weathered. It belonged to a Neanderthal. The excavation accelerated. The team began working with renewed urgency. Every year brought new pieces. A tooth here, a bone fragment there. Scientists, working with surgical precision, tweezed out one grain of sediment at a time, revealing the scattered remains of a single individual. They developed protocols for handling the bones, for extracting DNA without contamination, for preserving every fragment for future analysis. The work took years. The patience was extraordinary. By 2024, they had collected 31 teeth, portions of the skull, and 5 finger bones. It was one of the most complete Neanderthal skeletons recovered in France since the discovery at Saint-Césaire in 1979. It was an extraordinary find. But the real story wasn't in the bones themselves. It was in the DNA locked inside them. Inside one molar tooth, researchers found enough genetic material to sequence an entire genome. The tooth had been sitting in the sediment for 42,000 years. It had survived microbial degradation, chemical weathering, and the slow decay that destroys most biological material over such vast spans of time. But somehow, the DNA remained, preserved, protected, readable. The tooth belonged to a male, still unnamed in scientific literature until a Slimak gave him a name from Tolkien, Thoren, named after the dwarf king in The Hobbit. A mythical character because what Thoren represented was beginning to feel mythical too. An impossible survivor, a genetic anomaly, a story that shouldn't exist, but did. The story he carried in his DNA was almost impossible to believe. The initial analysis suggested Thoren lived somewhere between 50,000 and 42,000 years ago. Radiocarbon dating of his bones and teeth pointed to this range. Chemical analysis of his skeletal material indicated the era. The position of his remains in the cave's sediment layers, carefully mapped by archaeologists, suggested he had been buried roughly 42,000 years ago. Multiple lines of evidence converged on this time frame. But his genome told a completely different story. When scientists compared his DNA to other Neanderthals who had been sequenced, they found something shocking. His genetic structure didn't match the Neanderthals who lived at the same time. Instead, his DNA was nearly identical to Neanderthals who lived over 100,000 years ago. Ancient lineages, extinct populations, genetic ghosts from the deep past. This shouldn't be possible. DNA doesn't lie about time. It doesn't suddenly jump backward through the generations. The mutations accumulate. The genome changes gradually, predictably, measurably. Every parent passes variations to their children. Every generation carries slightly different genetic variants than the generation before. Over thousands and millions of years, this creates a molecular clock. You can read evolutionary history in the genome the way you read history in tree rings. But Thoren's genome was frozen in the past. His genetic signature suggested he belonged to a lineage that split from the main Neanderthal population around 105,000 years ago. A lineage that then spent the next 50,000 years completely isolated, cut off, separated. not mixing with any other Neanderthal group, even though other groups existed nearby, even though the evidence of their presence was undeniable. Think about what that means for a moment. 50,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Modern humans didn't develop agriculture until about 12,000 years ago. We hadn't built cities, written languages, or created the civilizations that would define our species. 50,000 years ago, humans were still hunter-gatherers making stone tools, living in small bands, migrating across landscapes, following herds. Neanderthals had been living this way for hundreds of thousands of years, and Thoren's lineage spent that entire span of time in complete genetic isolation from their own species. They lived in a world where other Neanderthals existed. The fossil record confirms it. Tool traditions suggest it. Archaeological sites show multiple groups occupying Europe during this period. Yet Thoren's population never contacted them, never mated with them, never exchanged even a single individual who could pass on genes. For 50,000 years, they stayed apart. The evidence for this isolation is written in Thoren's genome in a way that can't be denied or reinterpreted. Genetic scientists look for something called heterozygosity, the presence of different genetic variants in an individual's DNA. When populations mix, when individuals move between groups and breed, genetic variation increases. The genome becomes more diverse. But when populations stay isolated, when there's no gene flow between groups, genetic variation decreases. Inbreeding becomes inevitable in small populations. It's called inbreeding depression, and it leaves unmistakable signatures in a genome that any geneticist can read. Thoren carried an unusually high percentage of DNA segments containing consecutive pairs of identical gene variants. This signature indicates mating among close relatives in a small, isolated population. It indicates generations of cousins marrying cousins. It indicates a population so small that there were no choices left. Similar patterns have been found in Siberian Neanderthals, but Thoren's case was extreme. His entire lineage had been mating within itself for 50,000 years. And there's more evidence of this inbreeding in his physical form. Thoren had 2 extra lower molars, a trait called distomolars. This isn't something you see often in Neanderthals or modern humans. It appears in only a fraction of individuals and is often associated with inbreeding. It's a sign of genetic stress. It's a marker of what happens when genetic diversity dwindles to dangerously low levels. When populations become too small, when they mate only within themselves, strange things happen. Deleterious mutations accumulate, physical abnormalities emerge. The body expresses genetic damage that would normally be hidden. Thoren was literally marked by 50,000 years of his population's solitude. His teeth were different. His genes were different. His entire body was a record of extreme isolation written in bone and enamel. But here's the question that kept scientists awake at night, the question that drove the research forward. Why? Why would a Neanderthal population choose to remain isolated? Geography doesn't explain it. Thoren lived in Mediterranean France, in a rock shelter that overlooks a valley. It's not a remote, inaccessible location. It's not hidden in a mountain range or separated by vast deserts. The Rhone Valley is a corridor. It's a transit route. It's a place where populations naturally meet and mix. Other Neanderthals lived there. Archaeological evidence shows that modern humans and Neanderthals alternated occupation of Grotte Mandrin itself multiple times between about 56,800 and 40,000 years ago. They were using the same shelter. They were walking through the same valleys. They were sharing the same resources. They were breathing the same air, yet they never mixed genetically. The evidence is clear. No gene flow, no interbreeding, no genetic evidence of contact. The only explanation is social. Thoren's population deliberately kept itself separate. They saw other Neanderthals and chose not to interact with them. They had rules, perhaps, cultural taboos against mixing, tribal identities so strong that even facing extinction, they refused to break them. This wasn't passive isolation. This wasn't geography forcing them apart. This was active separation. This was a choice. Perhaps a choice so old and so ingrained in their culture that nobody alive anymore remembered why it had been made, but a choice nonetheless. And Thoren wasn't alone in this pattern. Scientists found evidence of another isolated Neanderthal lineage in the genetic data. A specimen called the Côte Neanderthal carried a different genetic signature, one that diverged from the ancestral European Neanderthal lineage over 80,000 years ago. Separate from Thoren's lineage, separate from the main population, another ghost group, another hidden population that existed in parallel to the known Neanderthal world. Multiple isolated populations, multiple genetic lineages that had been separate for tens of thousands of years. The picture that emerged was not of a unified species, but of a fragmented one, a species broken into pieces. The research team, led by Martin Sikora from the University of Copenhagen and Ludovic Slimak from the University of Toulouse, published their findings in September 2024 in the journal Cell Genomics. The title was measured, scientific, restrained by academic convention. But the implications were explosive. The abstract stated that Thoren's genome revealed evidence of a previously unknown population structure among late Neanderthals. Multiple isolated communities existed in Europe close to their time of extinction. These communities lived in neighboring regions, but showed limited, if any, level of interactions with each other in their final millennia. They had been separate for 50,000 years and remained separate until the end. What this means is that Neanderthals didn't go extinct as a unified species. They didn't gradually disappear due to competition with modern humans, climate change, or biological limitations. They went extinct as fragmented populations, isolated groups, tribes that refused to cooperate even in the face of existential threat. Thoren's lineage had been alone for 50,000 years. As extinction approached, they were still alone. They never reached out. They never tried to merge with other populations to strengthen their numbers. They stayed isolated until the very end. The walls between them never came down. The implications ripple through every understanding we have of Neanderthal society and culture. For decades, scientists assumed that late Neanderthals were a fairly homogeneous population. They shared tool technologies. They occupied overlapping geographic ranges. They seemed to be part of a single, interconnected metapopulation that moved across Europe, traded with each other, and maintained genetic exchange. But the genome tells a different story. It reveals that Neanderthals were organized into separate, socially distinct groups. These groups had their own traditions, their own identities, their own territories. And critically, they had their own rules about who could breed with whom. Exogamy, mating outside the group, is common in human societies as a way to forge alliances and prevent inbreeding. But Thoren's population didn't practice exogamy. They practiced strict endogamy. They married within their own lineage. They had rules that prevented outsiders from joining their group. For 50,000 years, these rules held firm. Consider what this means for understanding why Neanderthals went extinct. We've often portrayed Neanderthal extinction as a passive event. Modern humans arrived from Africa. Neanderthals couldn't compete. They died out. It was evolution at work. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. The narrative was simple and, in retrospect, far too simple. But the Thoren research suggests a more complex and darker story. Yes, modern humans arrived. Yes, climate changed. Dramatically. Yes, resources became scarcer and harder to find. All of that is true. But Neanderthals also failed themselves through social fragmentation. They were divided, fractured, unable or unwilling to unite. When Thoren's lineage faced the pressures of the late Pleistocene, the changing climate, the arrival of modern humans, they couldn't call on genetic reinforcement from other populations. They couldn't merge with stronger groups. They had spent so long isolated that genetic mixing with other Neanderthals might have been taboo, forbidden, unthinkable. The walls between them had become absolute. This interpretation challenges a fundamental assumption in paleoanthropology. We've tended to explain Neanderthal extinction as external, driven by forces outside their control. Humans, climate, predators, starvation, disease. We've treated Neanderthals as passive victims of circumstance. But what if Neanderthal extinction was partly internal? What if they were their own worst enemy? What if social structures, cultural rules, tribal identity, all the things that make a species human, ultimately doomed them? What if the very sophistication that allowed them to survive for 300,000 years also contained the seeds of their destruction? The irony is devastating. Modern humans survived because we were connected. We maintained trade networks across vast distances. We formed alliances with other groups. We traveled. We migrated. We mixed with other populations, other peoples, even other species. We interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, absorbing their genes into our own lineages. We were promiscuous, genetically speaking. We didn't have rigid tribal boundaries that prevented mating outside the group. We didn't have rules that kept populations isolated for 50,000 years. Our ancestors didn't divide themselves into fragments. And this genetic openness, this willingness to mix, might have been the difference between survival and extinction. Thoren lived during a period of intense transition. Modern humans had arrived in Europe. They were spreading through the continent, moving through territories that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. The climate was shifting. The world was becoming colder, drier, more unstable. Ice sheets were expanding. Vegetation was changing. Resources were contracting. It was a moment when flexibility, adaptability, and cooperation would have mattered immensely. It was a moment when every advantage counted. But Thoren's population chose isolation. They clung to their tribal identity. They refused to compromise. They refused to mix. And they paid for that choice with their extinction. The broader picture is even more unsettling. Scientists now believe that Thoren's population wasn't unique. They weren't just finding one isolated group living in secret genetic separation. They were finding evidence of a broader pattern. Multiple isolated populations, multiple ghost lineages, some known from fossil records, some visible only in genetic data. The late Neanderthal world wasn't unified. It wasn't a single species working together to survive. It was balkanized. It was politically fragmented. It was, in many ways, a mirror of our own world in its final moments. Tribes unable to cooperate, cultural boundaries too rigid to cross, tribalism so powerful that even in the face of apocalypse, unity was impossible. Modern humans arrived in this fractured landscape and found Neanderthals already weakened from within, not by competition alone, not by direct warfare necessarily, but by the inability to maintain the genetic cohesion necessary to resist pressure. The inability to coordinate across tribal boundaries, the inability to say, we are Neanderthals first, and our survival matters more than tribal identity. It's a sobering thought. We tend to think of extinction as something that happens to weak species, species that couldn't adapt, couldn't survive. But Thoren's story suggests that extinction can happen to intelligent species, to species with culture, language, technology, art, species that simply made the wrong choices about how to organize themselves socially, species that let tribalism defeat strategy, identity defeat survival. The research also revealed something peculiar about Thoren's teeth. He had 2 extra lower molars. This anomaly appears in only a small percentage of Neanderthals and is often associated with inbreeding. It's a marker of genetic stress. It's a physical manifestation of the genetic isolation his DNA revealed. Thoren was literally marked by 50,000 years of his population's solitude. His teeth were different from other Neanderthals. His genes were different. His entire body was a record of extreme isolation. When scientists examined his skull, they saw the marks of his lineage's choice, the unusual dental morphology, the skeletal proportions, shaped by generations of restricted breeding. Scientists also found evidence of his sex from the genetic material. Thoren was male. This matters because it provides context for understanding how his population was structured. Genetic studies of small, isolated populations show patterns of patriarchality, where females move to male territories after marriage, while males stay in their native groups. This creates maternal gene flow between groups. But Thoren's lineage showed almost no maternal gene flow. The mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited exclusively from the mother, was uniform. It didn't show signs of individuals moving between populations. Even the females, the primary vectors of genetic exchange in patriarchal societies, hadn't moved. This suggests incredibly rigid social structures, strict territorial boundaries, possibly even more rigid rules about female mobility than we see in most human societies. It suggests a system where women couldn't leave, where outsiders couldn't join, where the boundary between inside and outside was absolute. Grotte Mandrin itself is remarkable for another reason that makes Thoren's isolation even more striking. It's the only known site in the world where both modern humans and Neanderthals left clear archaeological signatures, not at the same time, but in alternating occupations. Evidence shows that this shelter was used by both species multiple times between about 56,800 and 40,000 years ago. They were literally taking turns living in the same cave, leaving their tools, their fires, their garbage, each species leaving evidence of their presence. And yet, genetically, there's no evidence that they interbred at this location. The Neanderthals who occupied Grotte Mandrin and the modern humans who occupied it didn't mix, at least not at this site. They were neighbors. They were using the same resource. This creates a fascinating question. Did these 2 species see each other? Did they know of each other's presence? Did they share the valley without conflict? Or did they simply never meet? The cave is large enough that multiple groups could have occupied it at different times without ever encountering one another. The shelter has multiple chambers and entrances. Groups could have used different sections. They could have passed through during different seasons. But the proximity is undeniable. They were so close, so tantalizingly close, and yet completely separate, modern humans and Neanderthals, 2 intelligent species, sharing a valley, possibly sharing a cave, but refusing or unable to mix. When the research was published, it sparked a wave of reassessment throughout paleoanthropology. Textbooks suddenly needed revision. The standard narrative of Neanderthal extinction had emphasized external factors. Climate change, particularly the Heinrich Stadil 5 event around 41,000 to 39,000 years ago, was believed to have stressed Neanderthal populations severely. Modern human migration into Europe around 43,000 to 41,000 years ago was seen as the decisive competitive pressure. But Thoren revealed an internal dimension to Neanderthal extinction, before climate killed them, before humans pushed them out, before resources became too scarce. Neanderthals were already killing themselves through social fragmentation. The genetics also revealed something about the timeline that matters deeply. Thoren lived at what appears to be the very end of the Neanderthal existence. 42,000 years ago is right at the edge of when Neanderthals disappeared entirely. He was one of the last, perhaps not the very last individual. Other sites might contain younger remains, but close to it. He lived in a world that was already losing its Neanderthals. Other groups were vanishing. Extinction was approaching. The species was dying, and his lineage, isolated and inbred, was facing it alone, still refusing to reach out, still maintaining the social boundaries that had separated them from their own species for 50,000 years. The walls never came down. The rules were never broken. Isolation unto death. Scientists can only speculate about what Thoren's world looked like. What did he see? Did he know that his species was ending? Did he encounter modern humans? Did his group trade with other Neanderthals, or was contact forbidden? Did he have any sense that the world was changing, that the rules that had governed his lineage for 50 millennia were about to become irrelevant? We'll never know. The evidence is locked in his bones, in his teeth, in the genetic code that was recovered from a single molar. But that evidence is clear and undeniable. Thoren belonged to a lineage that had chosen isolation. Over 50,000 years, that choice had become absolute. It was built into their culture, their identity, their sense of who was acceptable as a mate. And when extinction came, when the climate shifted and modern humans arrived and resources dwindled, they faced it divided, broken, unable or unwilling to reach across the barriers they had built. The discovery of Thoren forces us to rethink everything about Neanderthal extinction. It wasn't simply that modern humans were smarter, faster, more adaptable. It wasn't simply that climate changed too rapidly for Neanderthals to handle. It's that Neanderthals were already fragmented, already isolated in pockets across Europe, already unable to coordinate or cooperate in the face of pressure. Some lineages, like Thoren's, had been trapped in genetic isolation for tens of thousands of years. Other lineages might have suffered different pressures, different stresses, but they were all separated, all divided, all locked into their own tribal territories and cultural identities, all convinced that their way was right, their rules were sacred, their boundaries were inviolable. And perhaps that's the most human thing about them. Modern humans pride ourselves on our sociability, our language, our ability to cooperate in large groups, but we also recognize the tragic tendency toward tribal division, the way groups cling to identity even at the cost of larger survival, the way cultural boundaries become more important than practical necessity, the way we choose us versus them even when us is facing extinction. Thoren's population exhibited this pattern 50,000 years before recorded history. They chose tribe over species survival. They chose cultural purity over genetic diversity. They chose isolation over alliance, and they paid for that choice with their extinction. Thoren's remains continue to be excavated. New bones still emerge from the sediment at Grotte Mandrin, piece by piece, grain by grain. Scientists still work to extract every detail from his skeleton, every protein, every molecular signature. The story is still being written, but the headline is already clear. Thoren represents not the triumph of Neanderthal adaptation, but the tragedy of Neanderthal division. He is the face of extinction, caused not by external forces alone, but by internal fracture, by the choice to remain separate, by the refusal to compromise, by the tribalism that runs so deep in human nature, so fundamental to who we are as a species, that even facing annihilation, we choose isolation over unity. And in that choice, we find the dark mirror of our own humanity reflected across 50,000 years of time. The broader implications of Thoren's story reach far beyond archaeology and into the realm of human psychology and social organization. Scientists recognize that what happened to Neanderthals wasn't biological failure, but cultural catastrophe. The genetic data tells a story of choice, of deliberately maintained boundaries, of rules so strict they became lethal. This raises profound questions about the nature of tribalism in intelligent species. How does a population maintain complete genetic isolation for 50,000 years when other populations live nearby? The answer lies in culture, in identity, in the stories they told themselves about who belonged and who didn't. These stories, whatever they were, became stronger than survival itself. They became more powerful than the species' own continuation. Modern humans, by contrast, broke down barriers. When Homo sapiens encountered Denisovans in Asia, they interbred, leaving genetic traces in modern Asian populations. When they met Neanderthals in Europe, at least some populations interbred, leaving Neanderthal DNA in modern non-African people. This willingness to mix, to bridge tribal boundaries might have been our greatest evolutionary advantage. Not our intelligence alone, not our technology, but our ability to overcome tribal identity in favor of genetic diversity and alliance. Thoren's lineage made the opposite choice, and it cost them everything. The tragedy is absolute and complete. A species intelligent enough to create culture, sophisticated enough to maintain complex social boundaries, advanced enough to survive 300,000 years of ice ages and climate shifts, was undone not by external forces, but by its own social rules. It's a haunting mirror held up to humanity. It asks us, what tribal boundaries are we maintaining today? What cultural rules are we treating as more important than collective survival? How much are we choosing our identity over our species' future?